A very good evening to you all. Let me welcome you to tonight's session. It is a session by the Racial Justice Advocacy Forum and the African Foundation for Development, AFFORD. Welcome to tonight's webinar. Let me just remind you of the context for today. For those of you who have been following the series with the Racial Justice Advocacy Forum, this is the fifth of the webinar, and we are looking at the topic of reparations. These webinars are an opportunity for churches, parachurch organizations, and Christians, in particular, to grapple with some of the important topics of reparations. This upcoming webinar, we will explore reparations within the context of restitution. It has been noted that the British museums, galleries, cultural institutions, cathedrals and churches have artifacts and human remains that were obtained under dubious means. There is a growing call for restitution regarding these items. And so tonight we will examine, what does restitution mean? And what does it mean in this context? What are these items in question? Who has them? And what should be done? I am delighted tonight to be joined by an excellent panel of speakers who you will hear from shortly. First, we have Onyekachi Wambu, who's the Executive Director for AFFORD. He's a former journalist and a television documentary maker and a respected voice on African affairs. We also have Dr. Janice Cheddie. She's a research consultant for AFFORD. She's a writer and researcher who has published widely on the issue of visual cultural difference and cultural democracy. She's currently a research consultant for AFFORD. Alongside them, we have Reddie. She's a curator. She has a master's degree in curating and collections and has previously worked for the British Museum in its coins and medals team. She's also worked as a project officer for the Methodist Church. And lastly, we have the Reverend Hudson Roberts from the Racial Justice Advocacy Forum. He's a founder member and he's the Justice Enabler for the Baptist Union of Great Britain. Let me finish with introducing myself. My name is Dion Graves-Andy. I work across the ecumenical landscape, so I'm the secretary for the National Church Leaders Forum, and my daytime job is as the principal advisor for ecumenical relations and theology at Christian Aid. We have a great panel and I'm really looking forward for the conversation tonight. We're going to kick off with Onyekachi, and he's going to explore the work that AFFORD are currently doing with the all-party parliamentary group on reparations and its importance at this juncture in British and world history. He will also explore contested histories and issues linked to the empire. Over to you, Onyekachi. You're on mute.
Thanks, Dion, and thanks to our partners for this event, Richard, Reddie, and others from the Advocacy Network. It's a tall order to try and handle in 10 minutes what you've asked me to do, but what I will do is to talk a little bit about the work that we're currently undertaking under the Return of the Icons program that we are running at AFFORD. And then, but also to talk about why there is heightened interest around these issues at the moment. So the work that we're doing, flagship element of that work is the all-party parliamentary group on African reparations, and AFFORD is one of two organizations that are providing secretariat support for the all-party group, which is co-chaired by MP for Streatham, Bell Rivera Ade, and also by Sir Peter Bottomley. And what we're doing is we've held one meeting already with the all-party group, and we're looking at issues of restitution with the forward. And the idea is to really bring those arguments into Parliament, just for parliamentarians to understand what the issues are that are at stake. And this is particularly important because the national museums, there's a bit of legislation, the 1963 Museums Act, that prevents the national museums, the British Museum, the V&A, those ones that are paid for directly by, or defined directly as national museums, to break up their collections. And so they're not allowed to do this by law. And of course, if you're going to have a restitution program where you're engaging with the British Museum to return the Benin Bronzes and some of the other items that they have, the Egyptian collection, the Elgin marbles, and all the other high-profile items, artifacts in their collections, then there is a conversation with lawmakers about why it's necessary to then change that law. So the all-party group is putting those issues on the agenda. We have 3 hearings that we are going to do over the next few months. The first one will be in July, and where we look at the issues of provenance and the issues of cataloging. The other thing that we have discovered in the work that we've done is that a lot of the museums don't even know what they have in the basements, and the material is not catalogued properly. They don't know where things came from because they're, as I said, they were poorly catalogued in the first place. So there's a big issue that we want to try and understand, first of all, in terms of that hearing, the first hearing that we're going to do under the APPG, and then the second hearing we'll be looking at the issues around the law and why we believe it's necessary for that law to be changed. And then the final hearing will be looking at issues of intellectual property and digitization. So there's a big program of work over the next few months to really try and understand that. And then the other work that we're doing as part of the all-party group is that actually the biggest collection of African artifacts is not held by the national museums. So some of that is held, most of that is held in the regional museums. So we've been involved in a program called Devolving Restitution, where we've been engaged with regional museums in Glasgow, in Derby, in the last one will be in Birmingham, but we've done Cambridge, Oxford, and Manchester, to get them to look at these issues and to bring these issues to the fore. But and then we have a Facebook page called Return of the Icons, and if you're able to visit or sign up as a member, we keep all the issues, keep our 600 plus members in abreast of all the developments in the restitution field. So that's the work that we're doing. But we started this program in 2019. Why did it happen then? Of course, this has been a long-standing campaign ever since Africans were enslaved and colonized, and we lost, we were defeated effectively. There have been campaigns for restitution, and we know that all manner of different agencies were involved in that conquest, in the colonization projects, from business, who in the context of West Africa and even in India with the East India Company, business tended to go in first, and then and business would go in supported by the military, and so there were a whole number of punitive expeditions and other military campaigns to conquer, and then following business and the military, normally the church would go in to provide, in the context of West Africa, it was the church that was providing the education through the missionary and the schools activities to ensure that the empire and the colony could function effectively for initially the business, the Royal Niger Company, and then later on for the state, when the state did eventually come in. So all these different agents were involved in the colonization project, and whilst they were there, they were effectively taking things. When Benin was sacked, there would have been, probably a religious chaplain that went along with the expedition, and part of what then happens is after the conquest, everybody takes what they want, because the booty was part of the way that the expedition was paid for. And then the church itself had all different kinds of relationships with different communities, whilst they were proselytizing and converting people, establishing schools. And one of the most important things that the churches were doing at that point was to undermine the existing religious beliefs. And so things were taken, shrines and other religious spaces were destroyed. And so each of these different agencies had a role to play in that colonization and colonial project. And we're now at a point, and I think, as I said, from the start, when Africans were enslaved or conquered through the colonial project, people resisted and demanded stuff back. But in a way, the momentum for all of this, I think personally, has really increased since around the early 90s, when a number of different movements came together to begin to really account for what had happened during the previous 400 years. And it wasn't a coincidence that these movements started to come together at the beginning of the 90s, because what we had in 94 was the end of that whole period of second-class citizenship and the codification of Black inferiority, which ends with the South African struggle and freedom in South Africa in 94. And then what happens is that everybody starts looking back at the victims, at what had happened to different people, what had happened to our cultures and everything else. So around 92, 93, the Organization for African Unity established a reparations committee and appointed an eminent persons group to look at the wide-ranging issues and to begin to look at what had happened, certainly on the continent, to the African world. And that movement was also involved the diaspora. The late great Bernie Grant attended that conference, the initial conference, and came back and launched the African reparations movement in the UK, and was one of those who really began to push this issue. I'm coming to the end of my 10 minutes, but I think it's really important to say that it's been a really slow burning campaign. Bernie did a lot, but it didn't really gain, these campaigns didn't really get popular traction until very recently. A lot of people have been involved in different elements of that restitution campaign. And what I'm trying to do now is to explain some of those different movements in response to the economic, social, cultural, and spiritual legacies of enslavement and colonization, is to understand that the different forces have been responding to them in what I'm now calling the 10 R's. So people have been fighting for recognition that things happened during that period. The first R, and then remembrance. So there've been a number of remembrance days for the victims, and then and movements, and then reparations that we've seen for for monetary compensation, and then restitution of artifacts and human remains. And then there've been other campaigns, as we know, from the 70s and elsewhere from the Rastas to actually return, to reconnect with Africa and return kind of physically. So there are a whole number of different interventions that different groups have been making as part of this program of repair. And the AU has a big plan for a 50-year plan up until 2063, where it hopes that if it does everything that is supposed to happen, then we will end up launching or relaunching an African Renaissance. And so a lot of what is going on is how all these different movements fit in and how we build both on the continent and in the diaspora to the idea of an African Renaissance. Obviously, the momentum for all of this, it's been slow burning, but in the last couple of years, it really took off following the tragic murder or the horrible murder of George Floyd in the States. And then over here, our Colston moment when the statue came down and the really reaction, the diasporic reaction has put this issue back on the agenda. I saw that yesterday Prince Charles is now talking about the need to teach properly the history of slavery in schools and everything else. All institutions are really engaged in reassessing their role, their involvement in what happened over the last 400 years. And there's an accounting going on. And it's really important that the church that played a huge role in the last 400 years, some of it was very good, but some of it also we know was supported the enterprise. The first ship that enslaved Africans was indeed called the good ship Jesus, as we know, or one of the first ships. So the church itself has been fundamental to what has gone on in the last 400 years. And we're really happy that today we are engaged and the wider program is engaged to see the ways that the church itself can begin the process of repair. And one of the ways is, rather than criticize lots of other people in the society, is to actually look at their own responsibility and the collections that they have in the church, and to look at ways that we can begin that process of discussing those collections and seeing whether we can return them to the communities that they belong to. So I'll end there, and Janice will talk about more specifically about some of or one of those collections.
Thank you so much, Onyekachi. I think you have quite a powerful insight, and to get us going, there was lots of themes that you were bringing up. The kind of the colonial project, legacy of empire. Clearly that struggle remains as it relates to artifacts and so forth. These horrible histories. Contested histories, not something that we read about or have easy access to. It feels like we need to dig a bit deeper. The role of religion, is that hindrance or help? Some really deep themes that just, I think, opens up the conversation, and looking forward to that bigger discussion later. We have Dr. Janice Cheddie coming to us now. I note some questions are coming through the chat box, and that's good. Thank you for that. I'm going to encourage you to use the Q&A box. That's going to be the go-to box for collating the questions that we will get into a little later, after all of the speakers have had their 10 minutes. So please do keep populating your questions in the Q&A box, and we will certainly pick them up. Janice, Dr. Janice Cheddie is coming to us to say a little bit about the museum collections and what they have. So talk to us and tell us what items are actually held by these museums, and how did they come to acquire them, and what's their reason for holding on to them?
Well, thank you, and thank you for everybody for inviting me. I'm going to focus on the Ethiopian tablets, partly because they're visible but also invisible, but also there's a radically different treatment within the British Museum specifically around the way it talks about the history of the Ethiopian Tablets and other items from that the Battle of Magdala and the Benin Bronzes. And there's actually quite a strong contrast. And I think maybe we can talk about that in the discussion about the way these different collections are treated, particularly if we talk about the tablets. It was an attack on a Christian African king by the British Army. And then finally, I think this collection is also interesting because it has a history of restitution of those items, both from the British Museum itself, but also from other collections. So if we could start the slide, please. Sorry, if I could share my screen, can I do that? Yeah. So yeah, so I'm just going to stress that I'm not a kind of expert on the tablets, but I'm just using them as an example around restitution. So what are the Ethiopian tablets? They're basically concentrated, painted or carved plaques, which is made of wood. And they're very, very sacred to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and is seen by the Church as representation of the Ark of the Covenant and the Ten Commandments. It represents the dwelling place of God on earth and is protected by a veil from public sight, only seen by priests. Removal from an Ethiopian church constitutes an act of sacrilege. So therefore, there are a number of tablets held in the British Museum and they cannot be seen because of this stipulation. So this is the question of why are they held within the church itself? How did they arrive? Sorry, I don't know if you can see. They arrived in the UK basically in a kind of well-known battle, particularly at the time it was well-known, called the Battle of Magdala. The Ethiopian Emperor Tawas had actually asked Queen Victoria for some help to protect himself and Ethiopia from the Muslim empires that surrounded him. But that request was either delayed or it was never granted. And so there was a capture of some hostages, including the British consular. And this then precipitated a backlash from the British public who wanted some intervention. And this resulted in a massive military campaign. If anybody's read Dan Hicks's book around the sacking of the Benin city, this is on a similar scale. And what we're talking about, which is often overlooked in this, is the hundreds and thousands of ordinary Ethiopians that died in that campaign. There were mass territory. They built 400 miles of railroad to get to the thing. So there was a lot of death, not only of the Ethiopian army, but of civilians itself. But what's interesting about that is the British Museum actually had somebody accompanying the British Army to select which items were to be sold. So on the 13th of April 1868, the Emperor's army was defeated and the Emperor committed suicide, used a gun presented to him by Queen Victoria. So, as I said, so Richard Holmes, who was an assistant at the Museum's Department of Manuscripts, accompanied the campaign to identify what items should be taken, what items were of value. And after the end of the campaign, there was a two-day auction where the loot of the Magdala was transported. And so this loot was justified because it was to pay for the cost of the war. And so eventually what happens is most of these items end up in museums across Europe. And so this is how the tablets have arrived in the museum. There's no dispute about the level of violence and plunder of the Magdala campaign. And even at the time, it was criticised by the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Prime Minister. So it's quite interesting that it's been largely forgotten. But as I say, the tablets are not seen. So if you go to room 66, what you see is very much this kind of obfuscation of what happened around Magdala. There's this lots of kind of signage which talks about a shared faith and the local traditions. And even this collection is not housed in the African Gallery in the Salisbury Wing, it's housed next to the Egyptian mummies. So the whole location and the way Egypt's Ethiopians' Christianity is kind of divorced from the rest of Africa itself. So when you go into the collection, this itself was actually taken in that raid. But if you look at the label, there's no mention of of this within that. So there's no signage when you go into that room about the Magdala looting and how the thing, and also no mention, interestingly enough, of the tablets itself. The fact that they're held in the museum, but nobody can see them, and that includes the director of the museum. So if you go to the website, there is a kind of an account within the British Museum's language, which talks about the kind of the battle and also its own role of a kind of a member of staff going and accompanying and identifying items that we'd be told. But they continue to use the terms acquired within that. This is also taken about from the website, but what's interesting is that it states, which I think is really important, is that no collections from the Magdala are actually held in Egypt at all. And I think that's really important to remember, which goes back to the Savoy report, which was published at the end of 2018, that 90% of Africa's cultural heritage is held outside Africa. This is an example of the ways in which Africa has been stripped of its cultural heritage, even though the museum in its display talks about a shared heritage of Christianity within that. So the other item that comes up is the way they treated the Emperor Tewodos, who killed himself. So his body was basically mutilated on his death, and a number of items entered into Britain, and 2 of his locks, which were taken from his hair, were in the National Museum, the National Army Museum in Chelsea until 2019. It's important to state that the Ethiopians, from the day that the things were taken, asked for the things to be returned. There was never a discontinuity in terms of the request for return. So the Tewodos ancestral remains were returned in 2019. But I think what's also interesting around the restitution debates is that even though the British Museum is covered by the 1963 Museum Act, which basically says that it cannot deaccession items, actually a number of items actually have been returned to Ethiopia. So the first one was in 1872, following a request from Emperor Janice. And so this is a kind of the glory of the King of Kings, a manuscript. And this was the basis of the 2 letters. And this manuscript is noteworthy because it's the only acquisition of the museum that's ever been returned to its former owners by the British Museum. So it sets a number of precedents in terms of restitution. But also we've had other restitutions. So in 1924, a silver crown was presented to Rastafari by King George. In 1942, a Bible from the Wellcome Trust collection was returned to Emperor Haile Selassie. In 1965, a seal and cap was returned by the present Queen Elizabeth Haile Selassie during a straight visit to Ethiopia. So there's a clear precedent of returning these sacred items to Ethiopia. And more recently, an Ethiopian tablet was returned by a church in Edinburgh in 2019. But I want to contrast the ways in which the Benin Bronzes is turned. And I think that's the difference in terms of the way the Benin bronze has entered popular culture and debates around the return and restitution. And I think that perhaps should be a subject to debate, why this somehow has caught the imagination of people who are arguing for restitution in the ways in which the Tablets haven't. And even though there is a shared Christian history, both within England and Ethiopia. So when you go down into the Benin Bronzes display, there's an open panel which talks about how the bronzes were acquired around the military campaign, and it also talks about dialogue with the Benin Dialogue Museum Group, which is a pan-European group looking at issues around restitution in relation to the Benin Bronzes. So there's a stark difference within the ways these two communities are treated, even though they are both at the result of very, very violent campaigns by the British Army. And there is no dispute within either of campaign about the violence that was greeted within by the African communities in this sense. So I think there's a question of why the Tablets haven't had the same level of kind of public interest. What was interesting is that when I went to the British Museum to take some photographs, there were some visiting Americans from the Abyssinian Baptist Church in New York, and they had gone deliberately to the display to actually look at some artifacts which also are represented within their own Christian church. And they were quite shocked, actually, that they didn't know of the Tablets' presence within the British Museum collection. So there is a kind of, even within the kind of Christian community itself, which has a direct link to the Tablets and the kind of Magdala treasures, that there's a lack of knowledge around their history and their presence in the British collection and how they arrived there. So we can see that that the Benin Bronzes have really captured imagination. And we look at the Black Panthers, the ways in which they reimagined a collection within the kind of museum of Britain, they called it, within the museum. And then there's a kind of a very violent restitution of the artifacts held in the museum. But the Tablets have certainly not had that kind of level of exposure or discussion within debates around restitution in this country. I think it's important to remember that the Ethiopians, along with a number of African museums, have really sought to enter the debates both within Parliament and with other cultural institutions. But they've also made a really important point that actually they possess modern museums which are fully capable of preserving the loot unjustly taken from Magdala. You know, we have a highly developed, very educated population within Ethiopia who are very able to look after these artifacts. And I'm going to end on a quote from Lord Carey, which was in March 30th in the House of Lords Common Debate. So he really talks about the respect for another nation's culture and values, and that the ways the Tablets entered the British Museum. So for Carey, he makes it really clear that the Tablets and the treasures on the Magdala should be returned to the Ethiopian people. And I think that it's really a question of why that hasn't really been taken up more popularly within the kind of Christian movement around restitution in the ways that we have seen around other artifacts. And I think that is a question perhaps we can discuss later in the panel. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, stop the share, sorry.
Thank you, Dr. Cheddie. Again, for quite powerful insight, taking us through that historical timeline. I myself, and I guess a number of people on this call, would have visited many of those museums. I have done the museum tour, the British Museum tour, And I'm again unsettled by the level of plundering, the violence, the bloodshed, and the sheer brutality in acquiring these items. I think, that there is much food there to be unpacked in the discussion later. Meanwhile, let us continue with Reddie, who's going to say a little bit about how churches handle their collections. Lily, tell us a little bit about how those churches indeed handle those collections, especially those that are held in the department headquarters. And what about the mission partners? Over to you.
Well, thank you. And it's great to be here this evening to have the opportunity to participate in this conversation alongside esteemed screen colleagues. What I thought interesting about our conversation today, the discussion actually seeks to highlight the issue of restitution and objects, primarily their dislocation from their homeland. However, what was actually key for me is that the conversation seeks to include the church, because for so long we've been used to the conversations being linked to the Premier League, as I would say, museums and galleries, but little emphasis has been placed upon the objects held in church and related organizations. And having sat through many PCC and similar church meetings, I can't say that discussions centered around objects' provenance, let alone contested objects, often appears on the agenda. Most recently, I became aware of an Antiguan font, baptismal font, that is now in a central London church, whose heritage is unknown to most of the congregation, and certainly with its lack of inscription and detailing provenance, suggests to me that its arrival is likely to be somewhat dubious. But that's why conversations such as these are so important. As has been said, I've worked within heritage sector and previously been within the museum world, but also as a Christian, I have experience of working within the church, specifically with those engaging in mission activity, which included liaising with partner churches throughout the African continent and overseas personnel working within Africa and the Caribbean. So it's been my experience that mission partners, those we used to call missionaries, have been a rich source of object collection, whether through gifts or by acquiring items. For that reason, I think that the people receiving them should realize that to hold on to such items too generously given, and they should be more encouraged to decline some of those more valuable kind of like gifts. And they should not take these artifacts because oftentimes they've ended up on mantelpieces at best, or languish in sheds and attics and places, and even worse than that. One of my experiences of working within that sector, working for a church organization, was that during a time of great refurbishments, I remember leaving the church building foyer only to see items such as Ashanti stools, decorative wood carvings, and other precious objects, which people were encouraged to take. And if they weren't taken, they more than likely ended up in skips or made their way to the likes of antique shops in Portobello Road. In fact, this was most recently kind of brought home to me because when entering a local antique shop, I saw again a can or a Ashanti stool on display for sale, and it kind of like brought back that past memory. And that leads me on to a next topic. As churches have these items, they are not stored properly because, as we all know, that many organizations do not necessarily see the role of the archivist as being very integral or very important any longer. It was one of those roles that in years gone by, decades gone by, it was an important role, but you'll find that like lots of low-hanging fruit, it's those types of roles that have often disappeared. But those archivists that still exist in such organizations are often actually, they actually are caught up with working on the records of churches, or like the history of the organization. And that tends to be their main type of like focus. What they aren't actually doing is actually looking at collections. So all the kind of like works and the important type of valuable objects that many of these types of organizations and churches have within their stores often languish in basements, in attics, and are left. So one of the things I would call for is for churches to have a proper audit in terms of what materials they have, where they got them from, and also why they have them, and how are they being stored? What steps are they taking for proper conservation? And as part of that conversation, it has to be also a way of seeking to restitute the items. But before you return items, you have to know exactly what you have in your stores. And I know quite recently, the Church of England has a policy document which it has brought out called A Brief Guide to Contested Heritage in Cathedrals and Churches, which you can actually find on the Church of England site, which is a quite lengthy, useful document. It came out quite recently, I believe just April 2021. And I'm sure that obviously in the context of the time in which it would have arrived in many in trays, many churches may not have even actually been open or properly functioning as normal. And so many people, especially your little local churches, may not be aware of such a document. But it's quite key because, as I said, to be able to address the situation, you have to be able to assess it. So the churches and like organizations need to be able to make that type of assessment. And certainly this, I think, is like one step. And I would say that that's something that they should be encouraged to encourage their partner churches to actually do. I mentioned here about a mission and mission partners, and I think it's incumbent on the churches to engage with their counterparts in Africa and the Caribbean, as some of the histories they have go back centuries, and they need to engage in a critical dialogue with them to understand how best to return these items to where they come from. I can give an example of Zambian spears, ivory items, stools, which certainly belonged in a museum, but they found themselves in a living room. I corresponded with a mission partner who was in the process of downsizing as he was approaching retirement. He, being one of the more conscientious types, had felt a calling to actually contact our offices and advise that he had a few, as he said, a few items that he thought would be better to transfer and send back to the partner church. When I actually met with him, he actually came in with quite a large bag. When he opened the bag, what I saw inside were meter-long decorative spears, metal. They were wrapped up in cloths. And these objects, I was totally baffled as to why a serving minister would have been gifted such objects, and he himself as well was quite kind of perplexed, as much as he had admired them and had done his best to have kept them safely, but he himself didn't understand why he had actually been given them, but at least had had the grace to have actually brought them in and then sought to encourage them to be returned to his partner, former church. And I often thought that the strange power dynamics which exist in such settings is often why such objects are given with largesse. as frankly, it is the same body to whom you might be seeking to request grants for the machinery which helped to create the borehole that your little village might need, or indeed the funding for the necessary extension to a school building. However, even though offered, the mission partners being offered such items, it is also important to know when generosity has been taken too far. Or even more relevant are the 2 Benin Bronzes gifted to the former Archbishop Robert Runcie, which have been pledged in April 2021 by Lambeth Palace to be returned to Nigeria. As such, I'm not sure how far that process is, how far along the road that is, but certainly my last information was that a pledge had been made, as we've heard with lots of different museums, like Horniman Museum, Aberdeen, and so on, who have entered into that process and dialogue with communities. And most recently as well, I've read of the Smithsonian Institute, that they have pledged their intention to return some 29 of the 39 Benin Bronzes that they hold in their collection. So that's something that I thought was quite kind of like key. So it would be good to know and see how far along Lambeth Palace are with that conversation, and whether they will be returning those Benin Bronzes. So in summary, I think that it is key that audits are completed and conversations had to develop a coherent strategy, which does more than offer our participation in a loan scheme to pledge restitution, but to carry through on those pledges to return objects to their homeland. It is good to offer or to have those conversations. I think over the last period of time, there have been many different conversations with community groups and like in that, their encouragement of partnering to share an object. Certainly I know that many of the museums have requested, especially say like the British Museum and others, in that having a kind of like dialogue, having a relationship, building up relationships with different organizations with a view to returning items, with a view to loaning items, but not the return or the restitution. Since 2020 and the murder of George Floyd, which has enabled us to have a more focused conversation on decolonization, I would suggest that churches cannot get caught up in a fixation with statues and stained glass windows, taking down statues and taking out stained glass windows. That conversation also needs to include restitution and of items and artifacts that are held in their stores and collections. And I would suggest that the policy document would be certainly a step that could be taken, which it exists already, and it's something that is in circulation, and that's certainly something that churches can actually embrace and actively start to participate in. And so I would say that that would be our means of actually assessing and getting to grips with what items are actually held in the stores as they stand. Okay, and I draw that to a close now.
Thank you, Lily, again for quite powerful input into this narrative. The questions around churches being associated with the brutality and the violence in acquiring these items, theft in one sense. And so the question around, what does it mean to engage with critical dialogue around these items and its return. We turn now to our final speaker, Reverend Wally Hudson Roberts. Wally, what do you think the Bible has to say on the issue of restitution?
Thank you, Dion.
Sorry, and specifically focus on what this means for British Christians and the church. What does it mean to biblically do the right thing?
I think my go-to text in response to the question you've posed is Leviticus chapter 24. In this text, the author portrays the importance and reflects on the power of Jubilee. At the heart of Jubilee is restitution, restoration, and reparations. Land, family, and resources would readily be stolen from a Jew if in debt. The stolen land acting as a form of repayment to the lender. The possibility of the debt being paid in full was usually unlikely, so this obviously meant that the person in debt could remain indebted, even enslaved indefinitely. Now there is, as some of us are possibly aware, a huge debate around whether Jubilee ever became public policy or not, as the case may be. The evidence suggests that the concept was never applied in the Jewish community. Whether it was applied or not to a degree is neither here or there, in my opinion. The theological message is the most important theme running through Leviticus chapter 24, not this academic debate around the application of Jubilee, yes or no, as the case may be. The fact that every 50 years, the land was returned to the person in debt and those debts cancelled and families returned to their natural habitat, which would often happen, says something about God, namely his commitment to restoration, his commitment to restitution, God's commitment also to reparations. Not that those three terms are separate, they are absolutely interconnected. But there is another passage, there's another message here, and it concerns God's commitment to those who have also been exploited by the powerful and the rich. For in the Jubilee tradition, if there was one, the rich were forced to return the resources they had gained illegally to the original and rightful owners. Yet again, God demonstrating his commitment to the poor and to the needy. Jubilee has relevance to the church, I think, in three ways. Firstly, the church must curate a theological voice, one that examines the root causes behind injustice. The church has to explore theological solutions to injustice, which center on, number one, restitution, number two, restoration, and number three, reparations. As I said, those themes should never be disconnected. They are all interconnected. But secondly, in relation to the church, if God is the originator of the Jubilee concept, whether it became public policy or not in Canaan, this is a secondary matter. God's invitation to the Jews was to showcase Jubilee as a way of life when they settled in Canaan. God therefore dreamt, and here is the theological message, God therefore dreamt that the Jews would live a life that embodied the values of Yahweh and to act out Jubilee. God invites the church to do the same, to live as Jubilee people, always restituting or making restitution, always restoring, always making reparations, not every 50 years, but as an embodiment and reflection of our lifestyle. But thirdly, thirdly, in relation to the church, and this is my final point, Jubilee provides the church with what I think is a theological and practical template which the church can creatively develop. This template invites God's new single humanity to look far beyond itself, look at injustice through the lens of the divine, and find solutions to this injustice that are centered on restoration, restitution, and reparations. Jubilee, as I see it, and this also connects with the church, is reparations writ large. It's a reparations act as it relates to the church that should not happen every 50 years, but should keep on happening and keep on happening. Indeed, it's a type of restoration that is completely reflective of the Christian lifestyle. So, in short, and in summary, the church, as it relates to Jubilee, should curate a theological voice. Secondly, the church also needs to engage the template reflected in Leviticus 24, and the church too needs to articulate its voice clearly and loudly, mindful that, again, as it relates to Jubilee, every 50 years on the Day of Atonement, the trumpets would sound and restitution would immediately be made. Now, there is something symbolic, I think, and significant about that trumpet being sounded. In other words, everybody needs to hear and everybody needs to act.
Thank you, Wally, for talking us through those Jubilee principles, you know, that are born out of that Jubilee message: restitution, restoration, and reparations. And again, we will have opportunity to unpack that a little more. So some questions are coming through, and that's good. I'm going to encourage you to do that. We've got about 25 minutes or so, just under half an hour. We will close by 9 to then really dig a bit deeper and go into this conversation. There have been some questions that have come in ahead of this webinar. So I'm going to use those first and then go to the questions that I see in the Q&A box. I note that there are some comments in the chat box, and that's good. I think some of the responses need to go to everybody. So I think there is a ask for a link. Can we just make sure that that goes to everybody beyond the panel and the hosts? So just going straight into the Q&A and kicking that off, I'm going to go to Janice. So Dr. Cheddie. There's a question that had come in, and then following on from that, I'm going to come to who am I coming to? Onyekachi, bear with me. So Janice, this question is for you. Are there any circumstances under which museums and galleries in particular should not return items, If so, what are they?
I think there's two things that we need to think about. If we're talking about things which are taken by military looting, we're talking about, general acceptance of theft. If things have been stolen from you, they should be returned. I mean, the conditionality of, which I hear this argument a lot, the conditionality which are played specifically on from museums from the global north to Africans and people from the global south, is that you don't have the knowledge, you don't have the institutions. There has to be some kind of reparations around that, around sharing skills, decentering skills, using some of those proceeds that have enriched Global North's museums by holding on to these institutions to share in some of those resources. But the central principle of, if things have been stolen, as in the, you know, the looting and sacking of Benin City, the Battle of Magdala, we could also talk about the raids in Sudan and General Gordon. I could go on and on. The general principle which is established, I know the English sadly don't like international law, is that things which are stolen should be returned. I mean, and I think that this infantilization by the global North of the global South, unable to look after its own culture, is frankly insulting. Is that, you know, we need to have part of that reparationary justice about looking after culture, making sure that education is part of that program. So that would be my answer really. So.
Thank you. I think that's really clear. I think there is a clear moral compass. You don't necessarily have to be a person of faith to understand, you know, do not steal, do not take what is not yours. And if we do, give it back. I don't think it needs a huge amount of moral conviction to understand that basic principle. Onyekachi, the question here for you is, what conversations are taking place between the cultural and political institutions in this country and those in Africa and the Caribbean?
Wow, that's a big question. I think there are multiple conversations going on globally between institutions and in the North, and also partner institutions in Africa and elsewhere. And so it really depends on which institutions you're talking about. Some are very progressive and have entered into different relationships. We know that, you know, Dundee University recently gave back a Benin Bronze. And we know that Cambridge, Jesus Courage, also gave back an item from Benin, a cockerel. So different institutions have started different conversations. On a national level, I'm not aware that there is very much going on between the British government and other African governments. The policy, as much as I understand it, is that we retain and we explain, which, you know, many of us think is an inadequate response to some of the points that Janice raised about theft and the need to atone. And also, I was listening to a program that Dr. Robert Beckford was making in Barbados, and he, one of his people that he interviewed extended this concept of the 10 hours to include. I don't think he'd read my paper, but it was interesting that he was talking about ours as well, but to include this idea not just of atonement, but also of repentance and redemption, and he was talking from the context of you know, a religious context, a Christian context. But some other governments outside of the UK at that national level have been much more progressive. The Germans have said and made a commitment to return everything that they have, and that would include not just artifacts and human remains, but also they're talking about stuff from you know, dinosaur or any other natural history you know, remains or you know, artifacts. So, and then different governments have, the Dutch are also indicating being open to conversations. Last week, the Belgian government returned Patrice Lumumba's tooth, which is the only surviving piece of his body after he was murdered and his body dissolved in acid. That was all that remained, and was taken as a trophy by two of the Belgian people who, Belgian officers who helped dispose of his body. So there are different movements and different conversations that are going on globally. As I said, on a national level in the UK, we're way behind where the Germans and others are.
Thank you. It feels like that is ongoing and will be ongoing for a time. Lily, a question to you, and I think you make the case for education, a powerful case for, educating ourselves. The question here is, why do you think Christians are unaware of these items, or, the items that have been taken for elsewhere and are sitting in their churches?
I think primarily, in many cases, a lot of items would have arrived, as I mentioned before, because of being fascinating. Mission partners living in a new country, either seeing these items, being fascinated by them, or being gifted these items, and in many cases returning home with said items. So not necessarily thinking about the significance of and the importance of the items, the materials that they were made from. I've recently heard of a case of a Ghanaian artifact, which actually had some, let's say some African kind of like mythological connection to it. So it wasn't really a religious artifact, but it was something that a minister said that he thought was just interesting. He liked it, just thought it was just something interesting, and he would just have it on his shelf until somebody who was Akan had come to his house and saw the item and then explained the history of this item. He then actually set about destroying a particular portion of it, which was supposed to have a spiritual kind of like connection, and he destroyed that aspect of it, which really quite sad, rather than actually return it to the peoples from which it actually came from. So many people, many kind of like mission partners collect items as souvenirs. And these are just memories that, they just collect them as souvenirs and take them home. Don't always think about the importance of those. That's one portion of them. Another, obviously, have gone to certain countries and have seen and understand the value of those items. In the past, they collected a lot of ivory. So I suppose when we look at programs like Antiques Roadshow, and sometimes we'll come across not so much ivory now, because obviously these are kind of like materials that are now on a list, and obviously those are items that we know them not to be items that we should be giving or selling or acquiring. But prior to that, many years back, many decades back, people would have been creating little trinket boxes and sharing them and then giving them away. So I would say that the church itself doesn't actually do a great job of looking at the items that it has. I mentioned about that font, and it is sitting in the Central London Church, and people are using it, but they don't know they don't know the heritage of it. It was mentioned that it was an Antiguan artifact. But if you don't know the heritage, and if you choose not to delve down and to analyze and to research further for whatever reason, then you will keep these things. And many churches have items in their stores. I came across very interesting items in basements, only because I was looking for other resource materials, and came across items that had been given to mission partners, whether they were specialized stools. And we know how important the stool is within many cultures, within West Africa especially. They were given these stools as presents, and just placed in basements, placed in attics, and that stayed there for decades. And it's only when you as somebody working there are actually looking for something else, do you actually come across those? Or sometimes you'll be in offices and you'll see these decorative items sitting on shelves, sitting on bookcases, propping up bookshelves and so on, and then realizing the true significance of these items. I remember in one particular case, there was, which I believe it was a West African stool, specifically I think was Ashanti. And I remember it just being in an office, and it was one of the secretaries. And when I say, I mean area secretaries. And he'd done a tour of duty. He'd been given this particular Ashanti stool, and it was just sitting on a shelf. And then I roll forward a few years later, being at British Museum stores, looking for something else, and seeing a crate full of those same stools, but they were extremely invaluable. But then I recollected how that one just sat on a shelf, propping up books. So I believe that the document that I mentioned before, that's something that I would say is a step that churches can take to actually start to find out, to make an audit, to find out exactly what do we have in our stores, what is it being used for, how are we caring for it, why do we have it? If we know that we have it and we acquired it through the various means, let's return it. Let's make those links. Let's return. Let's return those items. But certainly, yes, that's what I would say.
Thank you. There's a follow-up question around church education and Black history, but before I come to Dr. Janice on that, let me go to Wally. Picking up, kind of the themes of the Bible and what it has to say on the issue of restitution. Question that's come in. It depends how much of an Old Testament scholar you are. Wally, in the book of Ezra chapter 1, the story tells, or the narrative says something about King Cyrus returns the items taken to Babylon from Jerusalem. The question posed is, would you argue that this is a biblical example of restitution?
Could be. I'm not an Old Testament scholar, but there are a number of questions that need to be posed around the question before a definitive answer can be provided. Questions like, what type of revelation did Cyrus have from God? Questions like, were Cyrus's motives pure, or was he seeking simply to assuage his conscience, or was there some sort of political maneuvering taking place here? The answers to those questions, who knows what they are? But my understanding of Cyrus, however, having said that, is he was a relatively good king. He was certainly far better than other kings. Clearly, there was the repatriation of the Jews to Israel from Babylon, of which he was in part responsible for facilitating that process. So I can only imagine that the restitution he employed was authentic and had a level of integrity to it. I think, however, it does pose the question, some other questions which are related to that question, more complicated questions as well, because making restitution, engaging in a reparative justice process is absolutely important. Clearly, nobody would obviously challenge that or maybe even deny it. Though having said that, it needs to come from the heart, and it needs to come from a place of sacrifice and it needs to come from a place of theological integrity as well. Now, as I've said, I'm hoping that those values were embodied by Cyrus. We don't really know, we can only think that they were. But if I'm looking at this in the round, it really is important that those values are also embodied by others to make restitution authentic restitution.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that's a helpful and clear steer. Picking up the question in the Q&A from Kaz Mack. She asks the question, why doesn't the church educate about Black history? Dr. Cheddie, I think you wanted to come in here.
Actually, I'm sorry. I was looking at the Q&A and I did that. I can have a personal opinion. I mean, I think it's important to remember this is actually British history. You know, if you looked pre-1948, Britain basically had or identified a large portion of the world as part of its, you know, its territory, its history. And so I think what we're talking about is British history. It may not have happened in Britain, but it's part of British history. And I think that needs to be emphasized. It's not contested in the sense is that it needs to be told. And so those histories really need to be part of the, you know, that story of those island stories of what Britain, and also we know that these have real life consequences. You know, the Windrush scandal happened because people did not understand Britain's role in the world before the 1948 Nationality Act. So that's why we need to talk about it. I mean, and the church has to be part of that conversation as well. But I mean, I think other people can talk more eloquently than I about the role of the church in that story.
Will anybody else like from on the panel want to pick that up? Either Wally or Lily?
What was the question again? What was the question again?
Why doesn't the church educate about Black history?
It's another good question. Again, I think it's quite a complex one, but I think there are a number of factors. I think there's a theological factor here, which I think is critical and important, in the sense that there are large swathes of the church that have inculcated a theology, which means that they see Black and brown people less than white people. I think that could be one of the factors. Another factor could also be in the wording of the question, namely Black history. It's not normative. It's not a part of the mainstream. It's not a part of the status quo. It's not interpreted as authentic, helpful history. It's Black history, which therefore means it's automatically marginalized and disenfranchised. Black people don't have a voice, according to some, and therefore what valuable contribution are we going to make to shaping, informing and developing society? So therefore our history, our voices, by virtue of the fact that people see us as less, is not going to have the same voice of other histories. And again, another factor which is related to the second is Black history is seen as an alternative history. It's not on par with other historical narratives. And I think to a large degree, that interpretation of our history is influenced by the concept of whiteness. So, you know, race hierarchy, where whiteness is deemed as superior to Blackness. And so therefore, that particular voice, that interpretation of the world, that worldview, theology, philosophy is deemed as hugely important. It's a powerful paradigm in contrast with our voices, our history, which is less than. That comes from an understanding of white superiority. So there are many factors, and obviously I could go on, but I think those are just some reasons why I think our voice is not rendered as important or powerful as other voices.
Thank you. Time is running, so let me go to Onyekachi. Question here is, how has your work and books, how's your work and book by people, I think maybe that's books, by people like Dan Hicks and others, changed the conversation on restitution of items? How has your work? There you go.
Thanks for the question. I just wanted to go back very quickly to the education question.
Yes, please do.
I think Janice was right to frame it as a question of British history. I think what has happened is, you had that period of slavery, empire, and colonialism, and we've heard one side of that story. And what we're now beginning to hear are the other sides, what happened, because it was a part of British history, it was a part of what Britain was doing in all these different locations, and real people were impacted, but we haven't heard from their side of what happened in that exchange. Very few people, to go back to Magdala, know what Theodore was thinking, or how that impacted him, his family, the nation. We just haven't heard that story. So what these conversations are doing around and the return of the icons is that we're beginning to hear what actually happened and to have both sides of that story being told. I have a slogan that I've developed around the return of the icons, is that each icon has a story, and each icon has a history. And once we begin to look at that, and I really love the work that Janice did tonight, and also that Lily was doing, just in terms of talking about these specific artifacts and trying to talk about who created them, why they were created, and what purpose they had, and then you begin to understand the cultures that they come from. You begin to understand, and then that moment of dispossession, that moment of power, and then how their voices were then silenced for hundreds of years, and we're now starting to hear about those communities again. So what the education now has to do is to capture that, and capture all these multiple voices that are out there. In terms of the work, many of us have just been doing this work for a long time. I mean, I started a Remembrance Day in 1995. And it was going on quietly. But what happened, as was mentioned earlier, is that the George Floyd and the Colston moment has just put the work on a very popular level. So, and there is just a lot of, people have been thinking about this, but quietly. But what happened is that we just had this moment now where it's assumed engagement at a popular level. Young people have begun to look at ways of trying to understand their history and the issues that they're going through now in the context of that broader legacy of structural racism. Where did it come from? And all these items and these artifacts are part of that story. So the work that we're doing is just now, I see it as providing, as has been done this evening around a particular item, for instance, the tablets, is to increase the awareness, to increase the knowledge. But I think there's a yearning now for people to understand why, after so long, things have not changed in their lives, and why they continue to suffer microaggressions, why they continue to suffer structural racism, And there's a yearning to understand that. So that the work is trying to really contextualize that.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Time is running, and so I think that really was our last question before I wrap up and bid you farewell for tonight. My closing reflections really leans into much of what we've heard this evening. I am the daughter of two Caribbean heritages to some degree, part Guyanese. My father was Guyanese and my mother was from Nevis. The history that I have understood, learned, experienced as a child, been taught in school is a contested one. It is one where I hear from my family, extended family, those who lived the life, and then what I read in the textbooks. I'm going back a few years since I was in school, but I'm astonished by the continual effort it requires, to a word that Professor Robert Beckford uses all the time, to excavate our own history. A few years ago, visited the African American Museum in Washington. I think it was one of the last buildings President Barack Obama opened before he left office. I spent most of my time in the basement understanding African American history. I was left speechless for some time. I've spent time in Brussels. The one day I had off, I went to the museum and saw the appalling atrocities by the king and going back a couple of centuries, but the Belgium history and the brutality of colonizing in Africa. I remember being in Elmina Castle many years ago with 4 church leaders. It was a visit of solidarity, but the one day we had off, we went to Elmina Castle. 3 of those leaders had Caribbean backgrounds. 1 was Ghanaian himself. We went on that journey. It was about a 2.5-hour ride, talking and actually reflecting all the way there. On the journey back, we were all silent. None of us could have a coherent conversation with each other until the following morning. What am I saying? I think we have to continue that struggle. I heard that from the very first speaker, Onyekachi, who said to us, that kind of legacy of empire. It's not Black history, British history. It is our common history. And it feels like there's additional work that needs to be done to tell the other side of the story. If it is the victors that always write the pages of history, then I think the time is coming and there is growing appetite to tell the other side. Tonight's title, the restoration of African artifacts and human remains, is about telling that story. That story is truth. It is our truth. It is, kind of our history, our story. And to get it out there so that there's a balanced picture continues to take effort, resources, time. It is big conversations that sometimes grabs the headlines. Sometimes it's side conversations. It's webinars like this. It's big public policy conferences, because once you become aware of it, you can't unlearn that, right? People talk about the genie out of the bottle. Then you have to act and do something about that and hold people to account. The basic premise here that I've heard throughout all of our 4 speakers is that stuff was taken. Precious, kind of items, sacred items, ceremonial items was taken as souvenirs of war, spoils of war, illegal wars. If that was today's picture, the British public, all publics will be up in arms. But actually, now that that's somehow redundant to history, then this idea of, what I talked about, the Jubilee principle, to give back what was unrightfully taken, that is a common basic principle, I would say. a basic human right. You don't know, kind of need, I wouldn't like to think you need huge convincing to do the right thing. I guess I remain with this statement, which is where I arrived in today's conversation, that we cannot be silent about this. We must speak out. We must seek to tell the truth and make sure that those who are accountable are held accountable to make right what was made wrong. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. It has been my absolute pleasure to facilitate this conversation. I want to thank you. So wherever you're sitting in your homes, please give a little virtual applause to our speakers this evening. Onyekachi Wambu, Dr. Jane Cheddie, Lily Reddie, and the Reverend Wally Hudson Roberts, sorry, Wally. Thank you very much for joining us. May you be blessed for the rest of this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.